The world has felt smaller ever since the invention of the aeroplane. Journeys that would once take weeks or even months by sea can now be achieved in a matter of hours. An expert writing in the New York Times in 1903 claimed that man wouldn't be able to fly for 1 million years. But it didn't take long for them to be proven wrong. Planes have been getting bigger and better ever since the first powered flight in December that year. So let's check out some of the biggest of all time. We'll start with a plane that's the brainchild of a well-known tech billionaire. No, we're not talking about Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. Instead, we're talking about Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. Since leaving Microsoft, Allen has set up an aviation company called Strata Launch and developed a colossal plane called the Model 351 Strata Launch aircraft. This is a behemoth of the sky. Its wingspan of 385 feet makes it the widest plane ever to fly. The plane's unorthodox design includes a twin fuselage and no fewer than 6 engines, each with its own fuel tank. 6 engines mean 6 fuel tanks, and there are 8 sets of landing gear to make sure touching down is a smooth process. Amazingly, almost every piece of the prototype was built with old parts taken from Boeing 747 units. The original plan for the 351 Strata Launch was to take Pegasus XL rockets to the upper limits of Earth's atmosphere so they could be launched into space, but plans changed in 2019, and the new vision for the 351 is for it to become a high-altitude passenger service. Allen thinks that the plane could effectively cut the flight time from the USA to Australia in half. During the peak years of the Cold War, the United States of America and the USSR spent billions of dollars trying to one-up each other in any way possible. That led to some impressive breakthroughs in the field of aviation. One of those breakthroughs is the Antonov AN-225 Mriya aircraft. Unfortunately for her creators, by the time she arrived in 1988, the Soviet Union was close to the point of collapse, and the Cold War was all but over. Even today, more than 30 years later, the AN-225 Mriya is one of the biggest planes ever built. From nose to tail, she measures 260 feet. The Soviets wanted the plane to be their answer to the shuttle carrier planes built by the USA. It can carry up to 400,000 pounds of weight strapped to its fuselage with no problems, so it would have suited that task perfectly. The prototype is the only unit that was ever completed. A second AN-225 was in the process of being built when the USSR collapsed, and has been in storage ever since. There's a twist in this tale, though. China expressed an interest in reviving the plane and continuing its development in 2016. And although things have gone quiet since then, the project might be going on in secret. Here's a massive plane that deserves a better name than the one it ended up with. Its nickname is Frankenplane, which is hardly complimentary, but its given name of the Super Guppy isn't much better. The nickname comes from the fact that the Super Guppy is patched together from pieces of various other planes. The result is an aircraft that's utterly unique. The Super Guppy is the only vehicle in the world that can load and transport an SIVB stage from a Saturn V space rocket. It would have to be considered a little archaic by modern standards because it was built in 1965. But one of the 5 units that were completed is still in service with NASA. The foundation of the plane is a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, but you do well to spot the shell of it among all the other pieces that have been built around it. At 143 feet long and 60 feet tall, with an internal diameter of 25 feet, it's the airborne equivalent of a cargo train. It's been over 50 years since the Super Guppy was built, and in all that time, we've never built anything capable of carrying heavier loads through the air. The aircraft we've looked at so far were made for specialist purposes, so let's check out a giant passenger plane now to give a sense of perspective. This is the Airbus A340. The first plane of this class was built in 1987. And it entered service with Air France and Lufthansa in March 1993. A second, even larger type of A340 was developed in 1997 and entered service in August 2002. Production officially ended in 2011, but 24 of the planes are still active today with Lufthansa, Mahan Air, South African Airways, and Swiss International Airlines. It was the longest passenger airliner in the world until Boeing produced the Boeing 747-8 in 2010. The largest variant, the A340-600, is 247 feet long, with a wingspan of 208 feet and a height of 59 feet, with space for over 7,000 cubic feet of cargo. Aside from all of its impressive technical accomplishments, the aircraft is notable for never being involved in a single fatal accident in almost 30 years of active service. That's not something you can say about most models of passenger plane. Military planes tend to stay in service for longer than passenger planes. You only need to look at the Lockheed C5 Galaxy for evidence of that. This large-scale military transport aircraft was approved for active service in June 1970 after completing its first test flight in June 1968, and is still in service to this day. The plane is exclusive to the United States Air Force and can carry all air certifiable cargo. Airlifter planes of this class saw action in the Vietnam War, as well as military operations in Iraq, Yugoslavia, and Afghanistan. It's a remarkable legacy when you consider that cost overruns and lengthy delays during the 1960s almost saw the plane canceled before its maiden flight. The aircraft is 247 feet long and 65 feet tall, with a 222-foot wingspan. The 58 units that are still active today have all been extensively upgraded and are technically known as C5M Super Galaxy variants. You'd probably assume that they're approaching the end of their useful life, but all 58 are currently scheduled to undergo modernization processes that will keep them in the Air Force for at least another decade. The Boeing 747 Dreamlifter looks too chunky to fly, and yet it does. It's a plane so big that it almost defies the laws of physics. This is the longest cargo aircraft in the world, and also one of the most visually unique. Only 4 units have ever been built. This was a plane made with a very specific purpose in mind. Boeing needed an aircraft capable of transporting components for the 787 Dreamliner from one location to another across long distances. No such plane existed, and so Boeing created one. Even the AN-225, which we looked at earlier in this video, wouldn't have been up to the task. Each of the 4 units is technically a reconfigured 747-400, although the bulging fuselage must have been at least partially inspired by the Super Guppy. There's a hinge in the middle of the fuselage that literally cracks the plane open and splits it in two, which is the only way to load the enormous plane parts that it needs to carry. The first unit of the new class launched from Taiwan in September 2006 and remains in active service today. If you thought the service length of the Lockheed C5 Galaxy was impressive, wait until you hear about the Boeing B-52 Strata Fortress. The first plane of this class successfully completed its test flight in April 1952 and entered military service in 1955. 744 units of the aircraft were completed in just 10 years between 1952 and 1962. That means there hasn't been a single new unit built in the past 60 years, and yet 76 units of the plane are still in service with the United States Air Force and NASA. The big military appeal of this long-range strategic bomber is that it can fly 8,800 miles without needing to stop to refuel. It was also designed to carry nuclear weapons, but has never actually done so. A Strata Fortress is 160 feet long, 40 feet tall, and has a wingspan of 185 feet, with a top speed of 650 miles per hour. The remaining B-52 fleet underwent a series of significant upgrades and modifications between 2013 and 2015, and based on current estimates, will continue to fly until the 2050s. That raises the prospect of the US military flying 100-year-old planes. Airbus knows a thing or two about making very large planes. We've already seen proof of that in this video. Here's another standout giant aircraft from their fleet. It's the Airbus Beluga, so named because of its obvious resemblance to the beluga whale. The original name for the plane was the Airbus A340-600 ST, with the ST in its name standing for Super Transporter. Beluga was just a nickname at first, but so many people took to using the nickname that Airbus eventually made it official. One of the 5 completed units of the aircraft is even painted to look like a whale, right down to its smiling mouth. The plane was introduced in September 1995 and tasked with carrying aircraft parts and other outside cargo all over the world. Belugas aren't especially long at 184 feet, but they have a carrying capacity of over 100,000 pounds. That makes them enormously useful, but it hasn't saved them from the chop. As things stand, the last of the Airbus Belugas will be retired from active service in 2025. They're to be replaced by the Beluga XL, an even bigger plane, which completed its first test flight in 2020. The Tupolev Tu-160 was first designed and built back when the Soviet Union still existed. Design work began in the 1970s, followed by a first test flight in 1981, and after extensive delays, approval for full military service in 1987. 36 units have been built since then, with plans to build more in the future. The planes have the NATO reporting name Blackjack, and are notable for being both the largest and the heaviest Mach 2 plus supersonic military planes ever built, as well as being both the largest and heaviest combat aircraft in the world. Despite its immense size, the Tu-160 also manages to be the world's fastest bomber plane. The latest version of the Flying Colossus is the Tu-160M2, which has modern engines, better electronics and avionics, a glass cockpit, and a longer range compared to the 1980s original. The upgrades are expected to keep the planes in the air for at least another 2 decades. Its record-setting measurements are 177 feet in length, 182 feet in wingspan, 43 feet in height, and an empty weight of nearly 250,000 pounds. The plane's max load for takeoff is an incredible 606,000 pounds. Even with all that bulk, it can fly at 1,380 miles per hour. We're not sure whether we should really class the Airlander 10 as a plane. However, it's definitely an aircraft, and so it's eligible for entry to our collection. The Airlander 10 that exists today is an extensive refit of the original, which first flew in 2016. It cost $40 million to develop and build for its owners, the Hybrid Air Vehicles Company. That sounds like a lot, but it's actually below the going rate for a modern plane. Disaster struck in 2017 with the Airlander broke away from its moorings, drifted away, and then deflated after hitting something and taking damage. Hybrid Air Vehicles briefly considered abandoning the project after the accident, but in 2019 they had a change of heart and went back to the drawing board. The result is an aircraft that's 5% longer than it was before the mishap, giving the revamped vehicle a length of 320 feet. Being inflatable means the aircraft is more delicate than your average plane, but it also means it produces 75% fewer emissions than any other aircraft in service today. The latest plan is to make it all electric, which will drop those emissions down to absolute zero. The Spruce Goose is one of the most famous planes in the world, which is no small achievement for an aircraft that only ever flew once. The plane, which is properly known as the Hughes H-4 Hercules, was the brainchild of the highly eccentric aviation and filmmaking pioneer Howard Hughes. He envisaged it as a kind of flying boat, suitable for large-scale troop transport during the Second World War. The snag was that by the time Hughes, a notorious perfectionist, declared his work to be complete, it was 1947 and the war was over. Hughes flew the plane once that year just to prove that it worked, and then put it into storage. The Spruce Goose is easily the largest wooden plane ever built, with a wingspan of over 320 feet. In fact, it had the largest wingspan of any plane in history, regardless of construction material, until the first flight of the Strata Launch. The plane is probably still in good enough condition to be flown today, although it's doubtful that anyone will ever try. It's now on display at the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum in Oregon, USA. The largest plane that a soldier in the Second World War might see in the air above them was the Messerschmitt Me-323 Gigant. As you've probably guessed already from the name, this was a German military transport aircraft and was comfortably the largest transport plane in service during the war years. In fact, its service was specific to the war years. The first plane of its class flew in 1942 and the last in 1944. During those 2 years, just under 200 units are thought to have been produced. In most cases, they were adapted versions of the pre-existing Me-321 military glider. Part of the reason that the Gigant's operational life was so short was that the event it was built for never happened. Hitler wanted the planes to play a key role in Operation Sea Lion, which was to be the Nazi invasion of Great Britain. Operation Sea Lion was cancelled when it became apparent that any attempt at a full invasion of Britain was doomed to failure. So instead, Hitler briefly considered using the completed units in Operation Barbarossa, which was the ongoing attempt to invade the Soviet Union. Obviously, that didn't go too well either, so by 1944 there was no longer any use for the planes. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!